mainly from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, actors were making a lot of movies per year because until you got into the 50s, TV didn't really start coming into play, and movies were kind of a hybrid of what we have now of TV and film. There were a lot more movies being produced. Actors were under contract. They were able to move from movie to movie a lot quicker than actors are now. They didn't have as much agency as to what they would do or where they would go, and they were just being pumped out movie after movie. Needless to say, someone like Bette Davis had a long filmography, and as we were going through it, it's like, how do we get this down to 10 movies? Wow, this is going to be tough. We would actually probably have to watch at least 15 to decide which 10 would be worth spotlighting. So it didn't really save us any time at all. So that's when I just threw it out there, and you quickly, without hesitation, jumped on board with maybe we should just pick one movie and go with it. And I think there were a few we considered. The ones that really stuck out to me are some of her earlier works and then some of her later works. This was kind of a mid-career film that we picked, All About Eve, in that it was when her career started dwindling down. She was in her 40s, and this helped give her a resurrection. This was kind of a soft spot in her career, obviously, from what I just mentioned. Aside from this movie, I don't know if there were a lot of movies in this time period that she did that were considered masterpieces. A lot of her really good work came when she was young, and then when she was older, movies like Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, I think really stood out to me. And then a lot of her early works that made her become famous in the first place. We did talk about one Bette Davis movie previously on a podcast.
Oh, yes. The Petrified Forest.
Petrified Forest. I know it was something
Yes.
Forest. So
Yes.
we did go over the Petrified Forest with a very young Bette Davis. She is my favorite actress of all time. And I would say that because one is it's hard to have a favorite actress. See, this is why I said I shouldn't go first, because I'd end up talking, talking, and talking. You're like, no, you go first. I'll interrupt
Yeah.
you. I haven't even gotten to the movie yet.
No, I know.
Here comes another 4-hour podcast about one movie.
Oh, man.
So, one of the reasons Bette Davis is my favorite actress is because with actresses, it's hard to have a favorite, to be honest with you, because there aren't a lot of films where there's a lead actress in every film, but there aren't a lot of films where the actress is the lead of the film. You have a lot of actresses that play supporting parts. They're not necessarily the best parts in the movie. When you come to more modern times, actresses aren't in a lot of films. So you may have someone like Julia Roberts or Sandra Bullock that have lengthy careers, but they generally get those lengthy careers from making very fluff type movies. I'm sure there are a lot of people that would say those are some of their favorite actresses, but I wouldn't. They don't make the type of films that I would be passionate about. They're more so romantic comedies. And to get an actress that really goes after really good meaty parts, I think of like a Nicole Kidman, Jodie Foster, but they don't make nearly as many movies. So it's like when you look at their filmography, you're like, man, I love Nicole Kidman in Eyes Wide Shut and To Die For and The Others and then you know you just it starts getting very thin. You start kind of having to reach a little bit more, and and that's kind of the problem. But when you get to Bette Davis or actresses that made films in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the filmographies are so big that they can afford to have several bombs, but then still have 8, 9, 10 movies that are just great. And that's just from a volume standpoint. So that's why for me, when I think of my favorite actors, they generally come from that era. Unless you have a Jack Nicholson, who's again one of my favorite actors, but he's been acting for so long that he's built up a filmography where you can look at like Shining and A Few Good Men and the original Batman or Batman '89 and just One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I could just go on and on and on of the great films he's made. So for me, that's kind of why Bette Davis is up there for me, because she was someone who was really dedicated to her craft to a fault. And I say this every time she comes up, and she's come up a lot of times when I've done videos, reviews, podcasting, whatever. I do bring it up a lot. I do bring her up a lot, that she wasn't the greatest person in the world. And the more I research her, the more I hear her stories about her, the less I think of her as a person. But all of the negative things come from her putting her career first and putting the part first and being vindictive and being cunning. And she's kind of like more like Eve in a way
Yes.
than anything else. Those qualities made her get the better parts. You know, she didn't go about it the most ethical way, but she did what she had to do to get the best parts available to her. So she was in a lot of great movies, and then she did step up a lot in those movies. So for those reasons, the fact that she has such a high volume of films, the fact that her films have such high quality, she worked with quality directors, she put out quality work for a long period of time beyond the studio era that ended in the 50s, and that resurrection she had late in her career. Just her overall body of work is kind of why she's one of my favorite actors. And again, there's a unique time period in her career. This movie kind of gave her that second life. And thank goodness it did, because it gave us a lot more great works from a great actress. We landed on Bette Davis, and ultimately, I guess I'll let you step in here and say your piece on Betty, and I'll let you explain how we ended up getting on All About Eve, how we decided to land on that one.
Okay, well, I was going to say that I remember taking a film course when I was young, and some woman in the class commented, we were watching an old movie, and she commented that she was pleased to see that the female character in this movie was strong, you know, and it was more like a modern character, not like an old-fashioned character. And the professor said, well, actually, I think that female characters in older movies are a lot better than female characters in modern movies. You know, they've kind of been relegated to the girlfriend of the hero or the wife of the hero. Like, there aren't that many great roles for women in modern times. Whereas back in the 30s and 40s, when actresses like Bette Davis were at the top of their game, there were a lot of really great roles for women, and there were a lot of big stars who were women. And I think that today, when you talk about great actresses, a lot of them do their best work in small independent films, right? They can't, you know, they don't really get the big blockbusters the way that, I don't know, say Arnold Schwarzenegger could be in a blockbuster film. But a lot of the, you know, best actress nominees will wind up, you know, they're coming from small movies, right? They're not the big mainstream movies the way, say, Bette Davis would have been back in the 30s, 40s, and in the 50s. So I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. And I think that's one reason why we have a lot of great actresses from that classic period. And Bette Davis is certainly one of them. And in terms of how we wound up on this film, well, I think it was just one of the films that we had on the list that was an absolute must. And you know, from my point of view, I thought, gee, I haven't seen this film in a while, so I would like to look at it again. So I kind of said, hey, let's do that one. But I don't recall if we had a really more of a reason than that, but I thought it would be a great excuse to revisit a great movie. And All About Eve, I think, is a great movie. And I think you're right that it's kind of the movie that resurrected her career, because she maybe wasn't quite box office poison the way sometimes they label actors or actresses box office poison. She wasn't quite there, but she'd made some films that didn't really do that well. And this was an opportunity for her to get back in a really good film. And I think everybody agrees that the script by Joseph Mankiewicz was an excellent script, like just one of the best scripts possibly ever written. And so right away when she had the chance to do it. She thought, "Oh yes, I want to do this movie." Um, yeah, so I think I was very pleased to get to look at this movie again.
Yeah, it's
And it,
interesting because the last podcast we did, one of the movies we covered was Mommy Dearest, a movie that you loved and you thought was a genuinely great movie for some strange reason. But that was based on, I say base using air quotes here since this is a podcast. It was based on Joan Crawford's life, and Joan Crawford is someone who's what go on to star in Bette Davis and Baby Jane.
yes,
And Crawford was someone who also had a 1950s career resurrection, I think with Johnny Guitar, that came out a
yes.
year after this, and she was considered box office poison. Someone, again, much like Bette Davis, that starred in a lot of movies and was
She
lead
also had
actor.
the two periods as well, where she was really popular in the 30s and 40s, and then again as an old lady, she sort of starred in a lot of popular movies. So kind of a similar trajectory that way too.
Yeah, yeah. When I first saw this movie, it was at a time period where I worked in a hotel I'm still working in now. A while ago, when I first started working there, the owner grew up in a movie theater that his dad owned, and it's all themed with 30s and 40s, mainly 30s and 40s, some 50s movies, original print posters that he watched as a kid. And he kind of was the one who introduced me to films like these, and I watched a lot of them on Turner Classic Films, where they would have the introduction, where they would tell you a little bit about the movie, show you the movie with an intro and an outro, give me a little bit of backdrop. And for me, that was a great experience. It was a great learning period for me for a lot of these films. Yeah, when I was watching them, I would generally go through the errors. I'd go through the 30s and the 40s, and I just go through it by error, and then eventually circle back to the 20s because it was a little bit much. I wanted to go chronological, but going into silent movies first was a little bit much. You kind of get a little bit warmed up before you can get into the silent film. So I went 30s, 40s, 50s, 20s. You know, the 30s were great, a lot of great gangster films, and we already did a list on some of the great gangster films from Warner Brothers in the 30s. When you got into the 40s, when you got into the film noir, I just thought that was just an amazing genre, an amazing time period. You go by decades and you break it down year by year. This was a great year for films, especially for films about films. Because I believe this year Sunset Boulevard also came out. To watch both of these movies for the first time in relatively close period of time, I was like, man, what was in the water in 1950? Because there were some great films. I mean, those are two at the top of the list, but there's some really good films made around this period of time. I think Sunset Boulevard is remembered more fondly because it's a little bit more artistic. This, like you said, it's an incredible script. It's very dense. They use a lot of analogies. The characters all come off almost like intellectuals. And it's more so the writer's an intellectual, so they're kind of a byproduct of the writer. When you watch a Quentin Tarantino film, everyone's a film expert. It's like, wait a minute, this girl's like 19 years old. How did she even hear about any of these movies? She should be talking about TikTok and Facebook and like Twitter or whatever. As you get with writers, all the actors are just an extension of that writer. You can tell the writer's an intellectual, he's a smart guy. There's a lot of analogies and double entendres and just biting dialogue, clever dialogue, a lot of cunning scheming. I don't do a lot of reading, but some of the reading I have done, A Song of Ice and Fire, that was turned into Game of Thrones. The reason I love the books and the show, at least for the first couple seasons, was how conniving everyone was, and all the backstabbing and all the planning and all the schemes. And this kind of reminded me of that. There was a lot of similarities there. I just love stuff like that, where you have all these, man, what's their motive? Where are they going with this? And all the setups and the plot twists and the callbacks. The script is just brilliant. I mean, we watched it for Bette Davis, but this was all about the writing and directing for this film.
Hmm. Absolutely, and some people have commented that it's almost more like a play in a way than a movie. You were commenting about Sunset Boulevard maybe being a little more technically interesting. I think that Joseph Mankiewicz, he was a director who, I mean, he was more about the writing in a way. He was more about the script and the story and the characters.
Because he
And
was originally a writer. He was a
yeah,
writer and a producer, and he wrote some great scripts. And he eventually got his opportunity to direct. But yeah, his heart and soul is a writer.
absolutely. And he really cared about characters, and he really cared about getting to the emotional truth or the psychological truth of the characters. And apparently, he would even uh, give his scripts to a psychiatrist and get an opinion as to whether, is this accurate? Is this right? Does this make sense? Um, which I find interesting because I knew a theater artistic director who used to do that with the plays that he was producing. He would take them to his psychiatrist and say, read this play and give me a report on the characters, which I found strange because it makes sense for Joseph Mankiewicz to do it because he's writing the script. So he can actually change it if it doesn't make sense. If the psychiatrist says, no, a person who has this problem wouldn't really do that, then Mankiewicz could change the script. But an artistic director of a theater should not be changing any scripts. It's against the rules. And so I don't know what you can do with that report other than just say, well, the psychiatrist says this. But it made me wonder if maybe that artistic director had been influenced by Joseph Mankiewicz. But I think he was much more interested in that kind of psychological truth, the characters, and I think he even would go so far as to say that he thought it was wrong for a director to try and put in fancy shots, or anything that would call attention to the shot, because you're kind of pulling people out of the story and the truth. And you're just saying, hey, look at me, I'm the director, and I made the camera do this, and I think in some ways I kind of agree with that. I think just tell the story and let the characters be, let the actors do their thing. And yeah, it is kind of weird when somebody does really fancy things or there's really crazy editing and people go, wow, that director's a genius. Did you see that crazy editing? And I'm going, well,
Angus, it is a visual medium. I hate to disagree with you, but it is a visual medium. I mean, this movie is brilliant, but if you were watching it on mute, it would just look like a 1950s TV soap opera or something. It's very visually bland. The one scene, I think that was a real exterior scene where they're walking down the block, and it was just walking down the block. It was rear projection.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just so awkward. You could tell like they're walking in place. You could tell like the people behind them weren't really behind them. It just looked very odd. Obviously, probably
Yes.
didn't look odd for 1950, but looking at it now, it just looks very clunky and awkward. And you wonder why they couldn't just shoot at least one scene with them walking down the block. But
Yeah.
visually, I have to strongly disagree with you. This movie leaves a lot to be desired. It is very bland looking. It is, I don't know. It's just a lot of walking in and out of rooms, moving from room to room. Not a lot of exterior shots, not a lot of, no interesting angles, just two-shot, wide shot, close-ups. It's a very, very bland looking movie. Great movie, but visually, I don't know, man. I mean,
No, true.
You can have a great meal, but when you go to a restaurant, you want a great meal that also looks good. Presentation has to count for something.
Yes. Well, I would say there has to be a happy medium, and I think you're right that it is a little bland, and I think that he goes far in that direction. And that's why I say in some ways I agree, but I think there is a happy medium where you can hopefully have some interesting looking shots and maybe do some interesting moves, but it shouldn't draw you out of the story. It shouldn't be so crazy that it's like, whoa, that was an
and it shouldn't be so bland that it draws you out of the story too. It's like, it can be so bland that also draws you out of the story as well.
True.
Interesting enough, the one creative shot was like the last shot in the film which
Yes.
is a great shot, and
Yes.
it's a great metaphor too, because you're talking about Eve, and Eve is like the first woman, and then you have her usurping her idol, and then here comes someone that views Eve as her idol, and then that woman usurps Eve, the first woman, and then you see what Eve spawns as that young actress looks into the mirror, and we see hundreds of her. This
Yes.
is what Eve spawns. I think that was an interesting metaphor, and the writing, it's a great
Mhm.
shot, but the shot comes from the writing. So
Yes.
I think he inadvertently created a great shot. His writing forced him into a great shot because it aids the script as well, wraps it up in a nice, neat little package with the final shot.
That's right. The shot supports the script. It supports the story. It doesn't take you out of it. And even if it did, it was the last shot of the movie. So at that point, it's okay if you kind of exit. But I don't think it did. I think it supports it, and I think that's important, and that makes sense. But yeah, I think a happy medium would be best.
Betty Davis kind of got us to this movie, and got us to watch it as far as a subject. All the times that I have watched this movie prior to now, my focus has always been on this being a Betty Davis movie and watching it in the context of Betty Davis' performance. And while
Mm.
she is really good in the movie, I do have to say, in this rewatch, I thought that a lot of the actors were good in this movie. She didn't
Yeah.
necessarily fully stand out. I think what really stands out about her in this movie is the fact that she's willing to acknowledge her age and the vanity aspect of it, where vanity was a huge thing. It's a huge thing, period, when it comes to movie stars. And it's even bigger when you're talking about female movie stars. And then it's even amplified even more when you're talking about women in this era. Even today, a woman, the minute she plays a mother in a part, it's almost like she can't be a romantic lead anymore. Those rules kind of were written in this era that are still followed now. When a woman reaches a certain age, she can't really play a lead. Sometimes that's as young as 30, and here she's in her 40s. Yeah, we got into this for Betty. Betty was great, great resurrection. But again, in this rewatch, I think Anne Baxter was really good in this movie. I think she had more range, while you look at Betty as being like, oh man, in the context of her performance, the fact that we know Betty Davis as being a big star, even though she's playing a big star, the fact that we know she's actually a big star, I think that amplifies her performance, in that reality being mirrored by fiction. Almost that journey is a real journey that we're watching, like her insecurities and all those things are being played out. The only major difference, I would say, is we kind of feel sympathy for Davis's character, Margo, in this movie. Reality, Betty Davis, she didn't handle it like Margo did. Like she she didn't handle aging gracefully and people trying to come for the crown as gracefully as Margo did. Not even saying Margo handled it gracefully. That's just showing context to how poorly Betty Davis handled it. And that you come in for the crown, you better come correct, or you're gonna get your head chopped off. Because Betty Davis, she was tiny but very vicious and very bitter, and she would crush anyone in her way, in her path. But I think Anne Baxter deserves a lot of credit for her performance here, because she had to cover a more of a range with her character, from the facade that she put on to the character that she really was, and then the broken character that she is at the going towards the end, and then having to face, again, almost looking in the mirror, a younger version of herself, and see what she did to Betty Davis is now happening to her. Overall, I think her performance may have actually been better.
Yeah, I think they're both great performances. What I think is interesting is, I mean, I think that Betty Davis's character, Margot, I think she's our main character. I think we have to assume she's the main character of this story. But what's interesting is she kind of disappears toward the end of this movie. There's a bunch of stuff that happens involving Eve, and then there's a scene kind of where they're back in the wraparound story, the award show, and you see Margo there, and I think she only has one line at that point. She just has one line, and then there's about 7 or 8 minutes left in the movie that she's not in. So the movie kind of keeps going, and it's very unusual for the main character to kind of drop out, and it's almost as if Eve kind of becomes the main character in the end. I don't know. What did you think about that?
I think Eve was the main character. I mean, it's all
Do you?
about Eve, isn't it? I don't
Well,
think like Bette Davis was in much of the third act at all, because the minute she decided the minute she accepted the marriage proposal from her boyfriend, I think that ended her story arc. I mean,
yeah.
she didn't necessarily become a housewife because she agreed that she would go on tour with one of the plays. She said, "Hey, I'll go on tour with the play. I concede. Eve, you win, I lose. I'm just going to be happy with my husband. I'm going to go on tour with this play. My career is good. My life is good. I'm happy." That ends her arc. There's nowhere for her to go. But Eve's story needs to continue, because now Eve has everything she wants. Now we have to see Eve's downfall, which I think is the third act. She wins, Eve wins, and then that kind of begins the third act. Now she's on top, and now we see her fall from grace. I think that's kind of the third act, and I think Bette Davis has nothing to do with that act, and that's kind of why she disappeared. Not necessarily because, I mean, if she was in the movie, what would there be for her to do? Because there's her character is basically, she's kind of is where she is.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, you're right. There are clues like Eve is in the title and all that, but I still say she can't really be our main character because we don't really know anything about her in the beginning, and she's kind of presenting a false front. We don't really know what she's really after, and she's not really. We don't really like her ultimately, right? She's not really somebody we're sympathizing with in a way. I think we sympathize more with Margot's, you know.
Do you?
So
again,
so.
Angus, I'm gonna have to disagree with you. I think Margot's a bitch, and very unpopular opinion. Very unpopular opinion. I'll say this before I even continue. I think this movie reminds me of, and Bette Davis's performance and character reminds me of, Elizabeth Berkley in Showgirls.
Yes.
All she's doing the entire movie is throwing temper tantrums. And I keep thinking, why does anyone like her? If Eve is just as good of an actor and she's the right age for the part, why is Eve the bad guy or bad girl? Or what is she guilty of? She wants to be an actor. She wants the role. I mean, she's basically real life Bette Davis, except younger. She's kind of like what a young Bette Davis was. She wants a part. She'll do whatever it takes to get the part. Yes, she didn't go about it the best way, but no one's saying she's a bad actress in the movie. I'm not talking about, Anne Baxter. I'm saying Eve. No one's saying Eve is a bad actress in the movie. They're all praising her as an actress.
Yes.
She fits the part perfectly. And why exactly should we not root for her? Now we look at Bette Davis's character. She's yelling, she's condescending, she's bitter, she's angry, she looks down on everyone, she thinks she's better than everyone, she's entitled, she's a bitch, she's mean, she's I'm running out of ways to describe her, but I think these are am I wrong in any of these things that I'm saying about her character?
No, you're not wrong. But I think one thing she is she's honest, right? She's honest. she's not lying to people. She's not backstabbing people. Whereas Eve is lying right from the very first time we meet her. She's lying, and she's manipulating people, and she's trying to be, she's working to get what she wants in an underhanded way, and she's trying to steal people's husbands, and she's doing all kinds of things that I think we can agree are not admirable. She's not a character.
I mean, she's not married. So, I mean, again, so not to defend her, but the person that's not married can't be the person that's wrong. If two people are having an affair and one person's married and one person's not, the wrong person in that equation is the married person. So, I don't know.
Well, but I think that she's only doing it to try and better her career. Yeah. Right? She even says that later. Imagine if I marry this guy.
Not to play devil's advocate, but I'll play devil's advocate. Why should she be altruistic? Was she put on Earth to make someone else's life better? She just wants what's best for her. Isn't that what we all want? Are you put on this earth to make my life any easier? Am I put on this earth to make your life any? No. If I didn't do something that made you happy, would I be the bad guy? No. I'm going to do what makes me happy. And I think that's what people should do. And if what makes me happy also makes you happy, then that's a perfect medium. If you didn't want to do this podcast, then you shouldn't be on the podcast. If I didn't want to do this podcast, you shouldn't be here. The fact that we both want to do this podcast is the happy meeting point here. So I don't think that her looking out for her best interests is the worst thing in the world. The fact that her best interest isn't Bette Davis's best interest, I mean, there's the conflict, but I don't know. Is she the bad guy because there's only one part and there are two of them?
Well, I think you're asking questions that are bigger than this 1 hour podcast here. But I think that the difference is, you should do what makes you happy, but not if that means hurting other people, right? If you're going to, stab somebody and steal their money because that would make you happy, I think we can agree that's not good, right? That's bad behavior, right? So
yes.
Stealing somebody's husband because you think it might be a good career move is not a good move, in my opinion. And I don't think we're supposed to admire that. I think we're not supposed to admire her. But anyway, interesting you brought up Showgirls, because yes, I was going to say that another movie we talked about is kind of a version of this movie, kind of a version of All About Eve. And in a way, it's the reversal, right? Because I would say in that movie, Nomi, who is kind of the Eve character, she is our hero. And much like I would say Margo is the hero in this one, neither of them are likable. As you pointed out, they're both characters that, we have to wonder, why do people like these people? Why should we like these people? These people seem like jerks. But I think that that's kind of an interesting parallel and an interesting reversal, in that we're kind of supposed to sympathize with Nomi, and the older sort of showgirl, is kind of the bad person that we're not supposed to sympathize with so much in that movie. But it's interesting to see. And one difference that I think that works really well for this movie and not so much for Showgirls is that in All About Eve, they never show us any of the performances, right? We don't see the great performance that Eve supposedly does. She auditions, reads the part, and it's supposedly an amazing performance, but they don't show us that. So we can imagine it, and we can think, oh yeah, she must be amazing.
Yeah, they don't really show us the performances. I don't think anything would have benefited from us seeing them do like a play. I don't see how that would add to the film in any kind of a way.
No, I think it's smart that they didn't, because if we had seen her audition, we might say, well, gee, that doesn't seem that exciting. Why are people so excited about that? So it's better that they leave it to our imagination. Whereas in Showgirls, they keep showing us that same opening number from Goddess, and we just kind of go, "What the hell is this? This doesn't even make sense to me. Why do
Yeah,
people like this show?"
yeah. The only movie
But
I saw about show business that had good audition scenes was Mulholland Drive. I think that
oh yeah,
executed it pretty well. But it's
yeah,
very difficult to do like auditions or plays or movies within a movie and have it come off right. That's taking a bit of a
yes,
risk,
yes,
especially when the whole idea is she was brilliant. It's a lot easier for everyone in the movie to just acknowledge that it was brilliant rather than us to see it, and then we have to then come to that conclusion. If
yeah,
we don't think it's brilliant, then you have a problem. Like with
exactly,
Showgirls, we didn't think
yeah,
it was brilliant, and that affected our enjoyment of the movie.
that's
So
right.
when you're saying, "Oh my God, she was spectacular," it's like she better be spectacular when we're watching it, or like movie, you got a problem.
That's right. Yeah, somebody I know once commented about a play, which was about an artist, and they were showing you the artwork, and the artist was supposed to be brilliant, and my friend said, that's stupid. You've got to be a genius to pull that off. It's supposed to be a brilliant artist, and you're showing us the artwork. I mean, unless you're a brilliant artist, how are you going to do that? How are you going to create brilliant artwork? So it's much better to leave it to the imagination.
Yeah,
And yeah, and it's interesting watching this All About Eve. I had forgotten just how immersed it is in the theater world and theater culture. Um, I don't know why exactly, but I think in my mind I was kind of remembering it being more about Hollywood or something. But it's really about theater, and of course that's where I spent over 20 years of my life, kind of trying to work in theater, and so I kind of recognize a lot of these characters. Like it's a very accurate portrayal of a lot of people who you run into in the theater world. And so it's kind of an interesting watch for me, because I've kind of exited from that world, and I'm kind of happy to be out of that world. And so this was kind of throwing me back in, and I'm like, oh yeah, some of these people are not really pleasant people to be around. So in that way, I think it is a very, very good script. It really gets to the truth of a lot of the characters who you meet in that world, and probably just in any world, really, but certainly in that world.
the movie behind this movie is also really interesting as well. Good as this movie is I should say great. This is a great script. It's great direction. As visually bland as it is, it more than makes up for it with other aspects of filmmaking that was just brilliant. The movie behind the movie is also incredibly fascinating. So you have Joseph Mankiewicz, who evidently was a huge womanizer and just gleefully slept with as many women and actresses as he could. And it was well known to the fact that it put a great strain on his marriage. His wife would eventually commit suicide, I think, at like 45 years old. When he married her, she was an actress. And then he kind of wanted her to become a housewife. And she was foreign, she had a heavy accent. So even if he wanted to get her work, it would be difficult for her to get work. So it was a situation where here she's a foreigner, she's married this director, and in her mind, it's like, man, I'm in the United States, I'm married to a director and a writer. My career is going to the moon, and it goes nowhere. Not only does her career go nowhere, but her husband is now sleeping with all these younger, beautiful women that he's making movies with, that he should be making movies with me. And he's trying to turn her into a housewife. Who knows what her mental state was if you leave all this out of it? Maybe all of this was like 5, 2, 3, 10. Who knows what percentage it was, but I'm sure it didn't help in her eventually deciding to take her own life. You have a young Marilyn Monroe whose agent begged and pleaded for her to get this role in the movie, and I think the agent there, who was her boyfriend, died like a few years later after this movie was made. They made up a fake award as like satire to show like how, oh, like these, they just love giving themselves awards and all the speeches. So it was satirically making this award where these actors are just celebrating other actors. These industry people are just making awards to celebrate each other. And then they go and make that award, this fake award, into a real award, which is weird. And I think they gave one to Bette Davis as well. So it's just like, just the irony of that is just amazing. The actress that plays Bette Davis' friend, they hated each other because Bette Davis made fun of her the first day of shooting, and they hated each other for the rest of their lives after that. This is based on a short story. The real Eve, the person that it was based on, this evidently became the center of her life, is trying to get people to know that she was the real Eve, because no one knew who she was. Hey, acknowledge the fact that I'm the real Eve, even though you don't know who I am. And now, oh my God, you know who I am? This isn't the real me. So it's like she wanted people to know that this movie was her, just so once they knew it was her, then she could be mad that the way they portrayed her. But if she just kept her mouth shut, no one would know it was even based on her. And then no one would be noticing her. It's almost like the fame thing got to her in a way, because I heard the tapes of her as an old lady where she finally got a meeting with the woman who wrote the short story. And the woman who wrote the short story is like, listen, we're old ladies. Why are you still harassing me about this? You've been harassing me my whole life. First of all, the short story was only partially based on her, but she's saying it's a work of fiction. Of course it's not your real life. She just used the story as a jumping off point because evidently the story made her look like the villain where she wasn't actually the villain. But her defense is like, it's fiction. We use your story partially for me to write this story. And she's like, why are you harassing me? I just got like $5,000. I had nothing to do with the movie at all. Leave me alone. Like, she's basically been bothering this woman her whole life. And evidently she was harassing like the producers, the director, the actors. She just spent her whole life just stalking these people, trying to defend herself. What are you defending? No one knows who you are. So it's just like, I think the fame made her obsessed with trying to be acknowledged because she was an actress who didn't go on to do anything. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff like that that I read about and saw video and audio of that was just really interesting. That, like, as good as this movie is in front of the camera, a lot of the stuff behind the scenes was just unreal.
Absolutely. And a lot of people say that Bette Davis was really quite well behaved, and they had warned Mankiewicz ahead of time, you don't want to work with her. She's going to be trouble. She's going to be difficult. But she was actually really easy to get along with. She was very happy to be there, except for the Celeste Holm thing, where they did not get along. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. She sort of was on good behavior, but sort of not.
Yeah.
But that thing you're talking about there, that's almost like predicting Seinfeld 40 years ahead of time, where you've got the real Kramer going around giving Seinfeld reality tours and stuff like that, trying to get his little piece of fame,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny.
But it's kind of just sad, because I can see like her perspective. She's an actor, her career is going nowhere. Here's this huge movie that's used a story that's came from her. Like, however it came from her, part of this story came from her, but she's not reaping anything from it. She's not reaping any of the benefits from it. So how can I get my foot into the door? Acknowledge the fact that you did me wrong, make it up to me, like, give me something from this. And it's like, she got nothing from it. So you can kind of see her perspective, but she's kind of whacked out.
Yeah.
That sometimes that touch of fame can just completely ruin your whole life.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. One of the weird things that happened to me when I was watching the movie this time, I found myself thinking and having no idea why, but I was thinking, there's a certain similarity between this movie and Citizen Kane. And it's something
here
to do with,
you're comparing to Citizen Kane. I'm comparing it to Showgirls. Talk about two opposite ends of the spectrum.
Exactly, but I think it does compare to both.
But didn't Mankiewicz's older brother, I think, wrote like one of the
Yeah,
first drafts of
yeah,
Citizen Kane.
yeah. That's what I did not know that. I had no idea, or at least I'd forgotten if I ever knew that. And so I was sitting there thinking, in some ways this is a bit like Citizen Kane because it's a story about a person, and we're getting different people's perspectives on what that person was like, and we're kind of piecing their story together. It's a little bit like Citizen Kane. It's very, very different, but
Mhm.
it just made me think of that. And then afterwards, I discovered that, oh yeah, his brother co-wrote Citizen Kane, and there was apparently a bit of a rivalry between them. And Joseph Mankiewicz sort of spent a lot of his life trying to live up to his brother and trying to prove he was as good as or better than his
Well, I think
brother.
his father, from what I've read, the father kind of viewed the brother as the protege, like, the one who would represent the family. The brother was actually pretty brilliant, but he was an alcoholic and, he was a malcontent. I think there was a screening once and he insulted the head of the studio and he was like, "Is that Mankiewicz? You're fired. Get out." He didn't even turn around. He just, I think in the screening, the studio head was like, "This movie is exactly 11 minutes and 41 seconds too long." They were like, "How do you know it was exactly 11 minutes?" He says, "Because 11 minutes and 41 seconds ago, I had to move my butt in my seat. And that means the movie should have been over." The older Mankiewicz was like, "If your butt is the judge of it, there's plenty of other assholes in here that would," he said something to that effect where he was just insulting him. And then he was like, "Is that Mankiewicz? You're fired," without even turning around. So the only reason I'm aware of his older brother is because I'm a huge Orson Welles fan, and Hollywood hated Orson Welles, and Orson Welles hated Hollywood. The only movie that kind of acknowledged his greatness in Hollywood was Citizen Kane. And they wanted to discredit him as much as possible. So who knows how much writing Mankiewicz did and how much writing Orson Welles did. But the narrative is, at least in Hollywood circles, was, oh, Orson Welles is overrated. Mankiewicz script, that's the only reason that Citizens Kane was great, is because of that script. And Orson Welles had nothing to do with it. Get out of Hollywood, whatever, blah blah blah. Citizen Kane was his only uninterrupted Hollywood movie that he did in his whole career, which was his first one. But yeah, that's the only I'm aware of it, because they try to really discredit Orson Welles and say that the script had nothing to do with him, and the script is the only reason the film is successful. And I think either younger Mankiewicz or older Mankiewicz also wrote The Barefoot Contessa, which was another script that was written almost exactly like Citizen Kane, but the movie was awful and it flopped. But whatever.
Yeah.
Orson Welles is an idiot, according to them.
Well, that's ridiculous because one of the big differences between All About Eve and Citizen Kane is that Citizen Kane is much more technically innovative and groundbreaking, and that's all Orson Welles, right? That's all his direction and his technique, and kind of inventing the modern language of cinema in a way. Like a lot of the things he did have gone on to be copied by so many people.
Citizen
Whereas,
Kane is, if it's not the greatest film, it's one of the 5 greatest films ever made. All About Eve is a really, really, really good movie. Huge
mhm,
difference. Huge difference
yeah,
between really good and one of the greatest ever. So,
yeah, yes, yes. I think All About Eve, one of the reasons a lot of people admire it is that it's a great movie for women. A lot of women, strong female characters, and that's something that I think Joseph Mankiewicz was kind of known for, is that he kind of liked making movies about women. He did
yeah,
A
because
Letter
then
to
he could
Three
sleep with
Wives.
more of them. The more women he was around, the more he could sleep with.
Well, maybe that was one of his motivations. I don't know, but yeah, it's interesting because some people view it as a feminist film, and some people view it as a actually not feminist.
Yeah, I think there was backlash to the fact that Bette Davis was happy to be a wife, but I didn't view it that way. Do you look at that Bette Davis character and think that's not a feminist woman? She's going
No,
to give him hell the rest of that marriage. I mean, if
that's
what we
right.
saw on screen wasn't like an indication of who's in charge of that marriage, the fact that she was
Yeah.
happy to be a wife, I don't think should be a slight against her. But some feminists have come out against it. But I don't see it that way. I don't think her personality changed. She was just happy to be married. She's going to be cursing him out 3 days into that marriage, which is what happened in real life, because she really did marry that guy. And
Yeah.
I think they were both married, so they had to wait till their divorce is finalized. I think shortly after the movie, they got married, and the marriage went
Hmm.
sour quickly. But I think they stayed married for 10 years, but it was just
Yeah.
a rocky marriage the whole time.
Yeah.
Her character, she still was acting because she still said, "I'm gonna go on the road and do your play." So she still had
Oh
her
yeah.
career, and but
Yeah.
there was still some backlash, which I didn't get. I agree
Yeah.
with you. It's a
Yeah.
strong feminist movie.
And do you believe her anyway when she says, "Oh, I'll give up acting"? Like that. I hear a lot of people
Well, she
say
didn't
those
say
kind of
she would
things.
though. She didn't say
No,
she
no,
would in the
she didn't.
movie.
But even if she did, like, to
Mhm.
me, she would be back in 6 months. She might
Oh yeah.
she might
Oh yeah.
say she'll quit, but she's not going to quit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're right. She said that, "Oh, I'll go, I'll do the tour. I'll take a year to do the tour." So yeah, I don't think she's really given up her career. And I think in a way it's kind of like the modern thing that you see, characters saying that they want it all. Female characters, they want it all. They want to have the family and they want to have the career. And I think in some ways that's kind of what she's saying, except she's saying it a little differently because she's kind of got the career and she's now maybe wants the family.
They
But I
didn't
don't think
mention
she's gonna.
kids or anything like that. I don't know
No,
if she
no,
wanted a family.
no. Well, they didn't mention kids, but just the marriage and all that
Yeah.
stuff. And
Yeah.
so she wants to have both. She wants to be happy in both worlds, and so I don't think she really would give up her career ultimately. I don't think that
Yeah.
would ever happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that some people talk about, which I didn't notice at all, is that unlike one of the movies we talked about before, where the lesbian subtext is like really huge and it's not subtext at all, some people claim there is a lesbian subtext to this movie, and I didn't really notice it. But one of the things that they talk about is when Eve has a female friend make a phone call in the middle of the night, and they're both kind of dressed in their nightgowns or whatever it is they're wearing, and at the end they sort of join arm in arm and they walk up the stairs as if perhaps they're going back to bed. These two women. I didn't even notice that, but did
I
you have any
s-
thoughts about that?
I heard about that and I
Yeah,
looked for it when I rewatched it. And when I saw that scene, I'm like, no, there has to be another scene coming up. And there was no other scene coming up. I'm like, that's
yeah,
the scene?
yeah,
I think it was just because they both had short hair and they weren't glammed up, which
yeah.
is unusual for that time period
Yes,
to not be fully glammed up when you have a woman in a scene. And the fact that I think they were hugging each other going up the stairs, I think that's
yeah.
reaching. Unless Mankiewicz himself said that was subtext in the script, unless it came from him or someone that knew him, I think that's really reaching.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think if it's there, it's very subtle, and we never get an answer on it. So yeah, I think it would be just purely
And it
speculation.
came after the friend help her manipulate a man that she's in love with to come see her. That would contradict what a lover would want to do.
True, but unless that the maybe she's not in love with the man, and it's all just part of her manipulation to sort of it's career oriented, and it's not really love.
That's too subtle. I don't see it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I
Now
think it
you're
is
playing
too
devil's
subtle.
advocate.
Sort of. Yeah. One thing I loved about this movie is the character of Addison DeWitt, the critic,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
played by George
Another
Sanders.
person who would go on to commit suicide.
Absolutely, yeah. And I just love his character, and of course, I recognize that character. I mean, I've met people who are like that, and sort of the perhaps unscrupulous critic who uses his power to kind of get things that he wants, and manipulate people and whatnot. But I think one of my favorite scenes in the movie is toward the end where he kind of I don't know how to put it, but he lets Eve have it. He kind of tells her how it is. And to me, it's such a satisfying scene because you've been watching Eve kind of get away with things and manipulate things. And then he kind of says, is it possible, even conceivable, that you've confused me with that gang of backward children that you play tricks on? that you have the same contempt for me as you have for them. And then she denies it, and he says, look closely, Eve. It's time you did. I am Addison DeWitt. I am nobody's fool, least of all yours. And the scene goes on from there. And I don't want to get into spoilers or anything, but I just think it's this character who's like suddenly stands up and just says, okay, I'm going to set you straight. And I just love that scene. I think he's brilliant in it.
Didn't he win an Oscar for this one? He won a Best Supporting. He did. He did win an Oscar for this one. He's not. You don't think of him when you think of great actors, and I don't know if you can think of like, man, like I really loved that one George Sanders performance, but he's a supporting actor in a lot of movies, and he's always really good. And more, I think the thing I like most about him, not just his acting, the characters he plays. He gets to play the coolest characters. He gets to play the characters that always has a great speech or a great line. There's just something about the characters he gets to play in the movies that he's in. Anytime I see him in a movie, I always know he's going to have some great scenes. Mm-hmm. And it's not just his performance, but for whatever reason, writers, he just does some voodoo on them where they just write him some like really great lines, and he's just always good in his movies. Village of the Damned comes to mind. When you see him in a movie, you know like he's going to have some great scenes, and he was great in this.
Yeah. And of course, you mentioned he committed suicide. He was 65 at the time, and there were a lot of things going on there. And the last movie he made was actually the British satanic biker film Psychomania. And some people have suggested that he saw Psychomania and decided to kill himself. But I think that is not at all true, because I think he had a diagnosis of dementia. And so he was looking at, going downhill and having a lot of health problems. And he also had a bunch of tragedies, I think, the deaths of his third wife, his mother, and his brother, I think, all in the space of about a year. So I think there was a lot going on that inspired him to kill himself. I don't think it's because he was embarrassed by Psychomania, which is a movie I actually like, by the way.
Yeah, I think he was like, he lived an interesting life too. I think he was married to Zsa Zsa Gabor.
Yes.
At the time this came out, he divorced her and married her sister, which is really weird.
Yeah, very weird.
Yeah. I think even his suicide note letter was kind of cool too. He said something like, I'm bored with this life, or tired of what this. It was.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'll put it on the screen or something. But it was kind of like, he sounds like one of his characters, even in the suicide letter.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. This movie, there's so much you could talk about. It was. It inspired a musical. They made a musical version of this, and then they did just a straight play version of this. And apparently, the script was so good that they published it as essentially a play. They just published the script like years back, and it was the first one, I think, that wasn't a play.
When you just go from room to room, it's kind of easy to convert your movie into a play.
Oh yeah.
When you have no ambitions about locations or anything like that, your only focus is on your dialogue and your characters. It's kind of easy to do that. We're just because there's no real action in the movie at all. There's no real like locations. The play itself doesn't really play a factor. It's just people going from room to room, talking connivingly, talking about the business, talking about Bad Sabbath. It's just people having conversations. So I could see how that would work, because the dialogue is just amazing. The characters are brilliant. So yeah, I could definitely see that happening.
Talking about suicide, and often when I watch a movie and I look it up afterwards, I discover that somebody involved in the movie died young. This is just something I notice. Like, there's often at least one person that died young. And I haven't looked up everybody, but I noticed that Barbara Bates, who plays the character of Phoebe, who appears in the final scene of this movie, she's very young.
Didn't she commit suicide too?
She committed suicide at age 43. Yeah.
I think it was career related, but I'm not 100% sure, because her career didn't really go anywhere after this. this was, I think, the most major thing she did.
Yeah, she's
Zsa Zsa
mostly.
Gabor actually wanted to be in this part. She tried to get George Sanders to put her in there, which would have been
Yeah.
interesting.
Yes.
Historically, if from a historic standpoint, to say Zsa Zsa Gabor was in this, kind of like to say Marilyn Monroe was in this. She didn't really do much, but as a film historian, it's kind of interesting to see certain faces pop up in movies.
Yes. Apparently, George Sanders said to her, "Well, aren't you a little bit old to be playing this part?" And nobody's quite sure how old Zsa Zsa was, or her age was lied about so often. Like, I don't think we know to this day, when was she born? How old was she? We don't know. So that's interesting.
Yeah,
Ah,
yeah. I mean, this is an all-time great movie. Probably not even the best movie this year, which says how great of a year 1950 was, because Sunset Boulevard also came out this year.
yes.
But yeah, just a great performance. Mankiewicz was amazing, probably his best movie. Bette Davis, amazing. It's funny with this movie, the first time I saw the All About Eve plot, which is something that's just been recycled a lot, was in Single White Female.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure if you saw that movie or remember it, but it basically just uses the same thing,
Yeah.
where a single woman puts out an ad for a single white female looking for a roommate or something like that.
Yeah.
And then she got a roommate, and the roommate just slowly started to try to take over her life and be like her, which was
Yes.
kind of interesting. And then obviously we talked about Showgirls, and I think I mentioned this while we talked about Showgirls, and I did a movie called Hookers in Revolt that kind of used that whole storyline too, of like, you see someone that is living the life you want and you just take it over,
Yeah.
take their place. So it's an interesting concept, interesting story, and it was told brilliantly, and definitely highly recommend this movie.
Yeah, I do too. And one of the things I really like about it is that it's not really very black and white in the early
It's
period.
literally black and white,
Well, it
Angus.
is black and white. Yes, you're right. It's black and white. But what I'm saying is, um, at first, you don't really know if Eve is sincere or if she's a bad character or good character. You don't really know. And I think that some of the movies that have ripped it off, it's a little clearer from the get-go that yeah, this person's not good, you know. But I think for quite a while you could think, oh yeah, she's just a reasonable person, and it sort of slowly develops. It takes its time, and I appreciate that. But I think it is a very, very good movie. I think the writing is second to none. I think pretty much all the actors do an amazing job with it. Um, there's really not much you can say against it other than maybe it could have had a little more visual interest, but I think it works as is, and I really like it.
Yeah, brilliant movie. Glad we decided to rewatch it for the podcast because it's been a while since I've seen it. It's been criminally long since I've seen this movie. Even as I watch it, it's weird. There are very few movies that do this to me, but as I'm rewatching it, I'm like, man, I gotta watch this movie again. As I'm watching it, I'm thinking of that because the dialogue is just so good. As much as I'm absorbing here, I'm like, maybe there's stuff I'm missing, because it's so dense, and they're taking all these jabs at each other. And she was like, when she had that artichoke line, where she's like, maybe I'll show you the inside of an artichoke. I'm like, wait a minute, did I catch that correctly? Like, maybe I need to rewatch this movie to get the context of that comment. But it's just such brilliant writing.
Yeah,
It was just a joy to watch this, and yeah, glad we decided to do this one.
absolutely, and yeah, I agree 100%. I think Mankiewicz wrote a lot of pre-code movies, which had a lot of really interesting, hard-boiled, edgy dialogue, and I think we're seeing that in here, even though it's not pre-code and you have to be a little more careful, but it's still got some of that energy, which I love.